We're going to do garden calendaring. So a little overview, we're going to talk about the calendar in general and what to plant, how much to plant, when to plant, and what charts and things are available to you to help you with this planting. So the calendar. So in my house, every year in January, we pick one calendar that's the gardening calendar. That's where everything goes on for the garden on there. And then we sit down and plan out what we need to put on there. And so there's certain things that go on there. So, but kind of to look at a year in the gardening, here's where we'd start. So December, January, that's when all the seed catalogs come in. That's when you start perusing all those seed catalogs, looking through all of them. There was one point in time in my life where I think I got somewhere around 47 seed catalogs between December and January that I'd sit there and decide what seeds I wanted to get. I'm much better than that now. I think right now I only get like 3 or 4 catalogs and I only look at like 2 of them. But this is the time of year December, January is the time of year to plan out, get familiar with all the new varieties that are coming out and start making your list of what you want to plant. So January to May, if you're going to start your own seeds, this is the time of year you start. So in order for me to be able to get my peppers big enough and ready to plant outside, when I can start planting them outside, I actually have to start them the last week of January in order to be prepared to plant them outside and have a good size start to be able to put out there. And so usually January, February is when you start the process of planting the seeds. So my wife and I will actually take the calendar and we'll actually figure, okay, we want to plant outside. I'm down here in Twin Falls, so on a given year, usually Mother's Day weekend is when we can actually start planting outside. I know up there you got to wait till usually Memorial Day weekend or later, depending on the year. 2 years ago, Memorial Day was too early to plant down here. 2 years ago, we actually had a killing frost that killed most people's tomatoes on June 27th. So that's a really late frost for down here. But usually we'll figure out, okay, about Mother's Day, and then we start counting back. This is when I need to start my seeds. And we'll start planting those seeds out, those planting dates out. Okay, this one I need 8 weeks lead time. This one I need 14 weeks lead time, and start calendaring that out. So I know, okay, this week I've got to start these. Okay, April, May, if you're lucky with the weather, you can get out and start preparing the ground. If we're going to have a mild spring, you can actually start planting some of these cool season plantings out into the garden. So we'll get into these cool season crops a little later in the presentation, but about this time of year, if the weather cooperates, you can start planting certain things outside. So May, June, usually around Memorial Day, you can start planting these warm season crops. These would be your tomatoes, your peppers, your pumpkins, squash, melons. Those things can start going out about that time. June, August, if you do succession planting, you can start doing those succession plantings over a period of time. Down here in Twin Falls, we can actually get 12 plantings of beans on a 2-week succession planting throughout the growing season. And then essentially with these bush beans, essentially you'll have an unlimited harvest from July through pretty much September, first part of October with the bush beans, doing a succession planting about every 2 weeks. If you'd like help with figuring out what plants you can plant and a succession planting and where to plant them, Johnny's Seed on their website does have a really good on there. They have a resource tab that you can go to, and they actually have a spreadsheet where you can actually enter your last frost date, your first frost date in the fall, and it'll actually calculate it out. You can they've got a spreadsheet on the side with all the different plants on it, and you can actually select which plants you want to do a succession planting with, and it'll actually figure out the calendaring of what weeks you need to plant it. And you can do a 1 week between plantings, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, however you want to set it up. And so it's a really good tool if you want to look into succession planting. So July, August, you can actually start planting your cool season crops again for a fall harvest. And so you can plant them and then start harvesting in September, October, depending on what the weather does. So usually July through September, you spend a lot of time in the garden harvesting different produce. And then September, October, usually by then we've had a killing frost. You go out, you clean up the garden, you can add your compost, do the things you need to do in order to prep. And then the next year you start the calendar all over again. One thing I forgot to mention is keep notes. As you go throughout the year, keep a journal, write things down. Because it's hard to remember from year to year, okay, I really like this tomato, but trying to remember which tomato it was out of the, if you're like me, the 20 different tomato plants that you planted last year, remembering exactly which variety it is, but keep records, and it makes it easier as you start the planning process over for the next year. Okay, so what to plant? There's a list of questions that we're going to go through right now to determine what you need to plant. First one is, what do you like to eat? Plant what you like to eat. There are some things you can't. My family really likes to eat citrus. I just can't plant citrus in my garden to fill the needs, and it's not going to survive. What can you grow to save money? Look at what you're going to the store. What are you constantly buying? Is there any of that produce that you can actually produce yourself, that you can grow yourself to help you save some money? What space do you have available? We're going to refer to this space a couple of times throughout this presentation, but what space do you have available in order to plant? Are you going to can, freeze, or dry the produce? Do you have a spot to store it? Do you have the space to store that? If you're going to freeze it, do you have the freezer space? And if you're going to just do fresh eating, then you only need so much produce. If you're going to can and freeze it, you need a lot more in order to have that stockpile to make it worth canning and freezing. Are you going to grow any extra to share with other people? I have one of my master gardeners down here that he plants a big garden every year. It's just him and his wife, but he plants a big garden every year, and he donates most of the produce to the local food banks and one of the senior centers. And he probably donates, I'd say, close to 1,200 pounds of produce a year. And it mostly goes to the one senior center. What's the time to maturity? Look at those plants when you figure out, okay, I want to plant these things. Some of these plants take a long growing season, and they need a certain amount of heat in order to grow. And depending on whether we have a really late winter and an early fall, we may not have the maturity time in order to get that produce to mature. And then also, if you've dealt with diseases or pests in the problem, as you're going through those plant catalogs, they list what diseases or what pests that they have resistance to. And so you can actually start selecting varieties so you don't have to deal with these diseases and pests that you've had a problem with over the past few years. So you can actually select a different variety that will actually be resistant to that disease. So how much to plant? So the first thing is it just going to be fresh eating only? So if you're going to just do fresh eating, you may only need a couple of plants of lettuce for fresh eating. If you're going to do fresh eating and share with others, you're going to need more. So you can actually have more. Are you going to sell produce? If you're going to do a farmer's market, then you need to plan that, okay, people are going to want this produce for a longer period of time. Can I provide it for that longer period of time? How long can I actually produce? How many plants do I need in order to provide what my clientele is going to want. Are you going to be canning, freezing, or drying? You need to plan for that, okay, I want to can beans or beets this year, so I need to plant a large amount of those so I can have enough to actually make it worth bottling it. What's your family size? So when it goes back to that fresh eating, canning, freezing, drying, you have to take your family size into effect too. So my family, I have 8 kids, so there's 10 mouths in my house to feed. And fresh eating, if I only have a couple of lettuce plants, that's one meal. If I want to can beans, I essentially have to plant my whole property in beans just to have enough to can. Luckily, I have a few friends that are farmers that plant bush beans on the edges of their fields and then invite us out to come pick them, so we can do our canning from that way. And so that's one of the ways of going around the space issue. We'll talk about a few other ways that you can actually do. And then if you want to donate to food banks, our master gardeners down here actually went around to all the different food banks and places in the area that would accept donations and talk to them about what type of produce and things they would accept. And we've actually got a sheet that we put together for the whole Magic Valley area here. So if somebody has extra produce that they would like to donate, we actually have a sheet that we can give them of like 20 different places around the area that will actually take produce. And so space. So do you have enough space to plant what you want? That's one of the issues I'm running into at my house is I don't have the space in my property to grow what I need to grow as a garden space. So I'm looking at different ways that things can be done. One of the things that I found that works really well is to do vertical growing. So if you don't have a lot of space, a lot of these vine crops, even your tomatoes, can be grown vertically. So this is an older picture. This is when I used to live over east of Rigby. This is in my greenhouse. That's my son, who is now almost 15. So this picture's been around for a while. But we started growing vertically to maximize the space that which we had in the greenhouse. So you can see there on the left next to my son, we've got tomatoes. So those are, I think, bush steak tomatoes that we've got growing up the twine. On the right-hand side, using a cattle panel, we've got pole beans growing there. You can see behind my son, there's a squash plant there. And so using those vining plants to go vertically gives you a lot more space. You can do it in a raised bed also, or in your garden spot. Cucumbers work really well. I really like doing my cucumbers vertically because it's a whole lot easier to find the fruit because they're hanging there and you don't have to dig through the plants to find them. You do get a few that get down there on the ground that you got to dig for find, but anything that's going upright, it's really easy to find the produce. Here's another shot of another year growing in the greenhouse. And so we've got the squash and pumpkins, watermelon, growing on the cattle panels. The plant that's down there underneath that ceiling fan on the left-hand side of that cattle panel, there is a pumpkin that is about 2.5 feet tall and about 14 inches around that's hanging about 4 feet off the ground right there. So it is possible to do it. The only ones that I've had to worry about with actually supporting the fruit growing vertically is the watermelons and cantaloupes, because they'll get so heavy that they'll just fall off. But anything else will do just fine. So I mean, a lot of produce can actually be grown vertically. Okay. So the timing of the planting. So we look at the cool season versus the warm season. Some of those cool season crops we can actually plant out before our last frost. Our warm season crops, we have to wait till after the last frost. So how do we find those dates or what we can do when? So it's a question I got asked a lot right after I started with an extension. So I got asked, is there a chart that says what you can plant when in Idaho? And I'm like, No, there's not, but I can put one together. So I put one together. I made this nice little, I just did it in Excel, made a nice little spreadsheet of this chart. I posted it on our Facebook page, and in 3 months, it had over 32,000 shares of just this planting chart. And I'm like, well, if it's that popular, I should get credit for it. So I wrote the publication to go with the chart. And so this is a really good chart, publication to explain the planting process. And then it also includes the chart. The chart they actually put in the publication, they did black and white, even though I submitted them this nice color chart that had everything broken down, makes it easier to read, but they did a black and white chart in there. But this is a really good chart. You'll notice there's a note at the bottom of this that is kind of a caveat. Because we are in Idaho, these dates can fluctuate by 1 to 3 weeks, either direction. So we could be early or we could be late. But on average, these are about our common planting times that we can actually start planting plants outside. So I made this chart so it would fit the whole state of Idaho. So essentially, we've got Eastern Idaho with the zone 3-4, Southern Idaho with the zone 5-6, and then the Boise area in the zone 7s. So there's kind of, and I broke this chart down and put all the cool season crops up front, and then the warm season crops at the bottom. And so you can look at the dates on approximately when you can to start these indoors for being able to plant them outside when your weather should cooperate with planting them out. But you'll notice that the weather doesn't always cooperate with the chart. And so each year you're gonna have to fluctuate this a little bit.
Andy, we had a question come in the chat. What is the best way to attach vines to the trellises that won't damage them if you're trying to save that space?
If you've got a trellis like the cattle panels, I just weave them through and don't worry about actually attaching them. The cucumbers, I've even grown them up the cattle panels and then tied twine from the top of the cattle panel up to the top of the greenhouse. And they'll just wrap themselves around the twine. The tomatoes, I actually did use the tomato clips because they get a really thick stem on them. And it actually helps to support those by using those little tomato clips that you can get out of pretty much any of the garden catalogs. It clips around the string and then around the plant. But most of your vining plants will actually vine up on their own. The tomatoes, I've even woven through the fence myself, just kind of help them get going, and then they can actually do it on their own. But like your cucumbers, squashes, and your melons, they'll do it on their own themselves. Okay, so with these dates, there's a lot of different things you can look at. So I mean, you can actually look at, well, certain things I can actually get out a little earlier before I'd normally plant in the garden, but I have to watch the year. So I've been watching the weather this year because a couple of years ago, we were actually planting our cool season crops by mid-March down here just because of the way the weather was. I don't see that happening this year. It's been too cold and wet, and we still have snow on the ground. We were supposed to only get a 1/2 inch last night, and I ended up with 2.5 inches at my house. So. But yeah, so we just kind of have to watch the weather and adjust these charts. But these were done just as kind of on average what it is. If you want the closest to the exact date, the Farmer's Almanac is actually the closest because they have the longest track record of tracking these dates. And so if you want the closest one, you can actually go to the Farmer's Almanac, and on their website, you can actually put in your zip code and it'll actually tell you what they're figuring these dates will be each year. And so the chart is nice, but it's not going to be perfect every year. You're going to have to watch the weather and adjust according to the way the local weather is. That's what I have for the presentation. Are there any questions?